Hello there, this is Steve Kaufman again. Last little while I've been posting about multilingualism and have got some different kinds of responses. I got an excellent response to the video where I spoke in 10 languages. Recently I had a discussion here where I said that the present economic crisis could lead to a decline in the prestige of English as a language, because so much of our present economic system is based on, I would say, English language institutions, free market principles, which of course I do believe in. Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, which is kind of the cornerstone of that economic system. But for the last long while, the world has kind of been dependent on the US market for a lot of products. Tremendous consuming market, but a lot of that consumption is based on debt, tremendous debt. The extreme example being people who were encouraged to buy homes that they couldn't afford. And I think there's perhaps a realization that a world economy based on this engine, which is fired by debt, that some people may want to take another look at that. I am not in favor of massive government regulation as a solution. I think to some extent the economic crisis was building up, and if it hadn't been the subprime mortgage problem in the States, something else would have burst the bubble, with real estate prices inflating everywhere, with the price of oil all of a sudden spiking after having hung around the $20-30 mark for so many years. I mean, there was something strange in the world, and it had to be adjusted, and so the adjustment came. One of the commenters on my blog said no, that the economic crisis was caused by the greed of the stockbrokers, and it didn't matter whether they spoke Chinese, English, or Spanish. So therefore, the economic crisis is not going to affect the prestige of English, or is not going to cause English to decline. I don't think that commentator understood my point. It's all about prestige. French was very prestigious in the 19th century, early 19th century, in places like Germany and Russia. It was the language of diplomacy. It was well established. It reflected the tremendously dominant position that France had right up until the time of Napoleon, and perhaps for some years after that. So attitudes can change. And right now, the overachieving parents in Taiwan or Brazil or wherever, they want their children to go to English kindergarten. I hope that people will say, yeah, English is important. There's no reason why more people can't speak English as a second language and at the same time speak another language. In other words, encourage children to learn more than one language. And if non-English speaking people can learn English, then English speaking people can learn other languages. So it's not to say that we're going to get rid of English. It's just that the idea that everyone must learn English. English is the only way we are going to communicate internationally. I think that model is practical, and as one of the commentators pointed out, there's a lot of momentum behind English on the internet and scientific communities and so forth. It's very practical to have one language, and so I think that will remain. But I think it can become quite prestigious again. And hopefully it can be considered quite normal to speak more than one foreign language. So if you're not an English speaker, the first language is English, but then maybe Spanish or Chinese or some other language of interest. It doesn't really matter what it is. Another commentator said, we're going away from multilingualism because so many languages are threatened. But I don't think every little language has to be protected. I mean, that doesn't make sense. I think a lot of this sort of diversity emphasis is misplaced. We have seen in all of the major countries of the world that minor languages in those countries have disappeared. Does it really matter if a particular person speaks language A rather than language B? I mean, if it makes sense to maintain those languages, fine. If it doesn't, it doesn't. So where people have been successful at reviving minor languages like Hebrew, which wasn't spoken really that much for thousands of years, or or Welsh is making a comeback, and I know they're trying very hard with Basque and many other languages that I don't know about. Good for them, go for it. But that doesn't mean that every single minority language in the world has to be protected according to some moral, requirement. I'm all in favor of doing it if there's enough people who want to speak the language. And at Link, one day we would very much like to teach Cree and other Aboriginal languages, because that's of interest to me. That's part of our sort of unique heritage in Canada, that we have all of these different Aboriginal languages, most of which are disappearing, and it would be nice to try to maintain some of them. But because it's only if there are people interested in doing it. It's not something that's morally required. We get far too much moralizing about things that aren't really very moral at all. So, multilingualism. Which languages should one learn? It's entirely up to you. I think, obviously, if you have English, Chinese, and Spanish, you've got a lot of the world that you can communicate with. People in India do speak English to a large extent, I gather. But you could add to your ability to communicate with people if you learn Hindi. So those are some of the thoughts on. So I haven't given up on the idea of encouraging people to speak more than one language. And I think I don't believe that people lose the ability to learn languages when they get older. And I know that myself, I'm a better language learner today than at the age of 63 than I was when I was 15. No question. Because I know more about it, I know how to do it, I know the kind of attitude, I know how to get my brain more attentive, I know that I need a lot of input in the language, and if I can find interesting input, and if I focus on interesting input, I can power up in the language pretty quickly. I know that when I speak the language, I don't worry about making mistakes. I'm just a much better language learner at 63 than I was at 15. However, if we can get to children who are quite prepared to learn anything, and are curious and haven't yet been discouraged from learning by our school system, if we can offer to children stories, content of interest in 2 or 3 or 4 languages, expose them, rather than testing them on the subjunctive in grade 4, or requiring them to write tests or multiple choice questions in French or whatever language the school decided to teach. I mean, that's all so self-defeating, because most of those kids, at least in Canada, they're going to graduate from high school unable to speak French. So it doesn't matter what they got in French in grade 5. It doesn't matter at all. It's a complete waste of time. It's there purely to amuse the teachers. It serves no purpose. Far more useful. It would be far more useful to give them stories to listen to and read. I think a system like Link is ideal. They can develop words and phrases from their reading. They go into flashcards. You can make it a little more child-friendly with music and games. And they just play in different languages. Expose them to different languages. And at some point, if they are interested in learning a language, then they'll do it. But at least expose them to the fact that there are many ways of saying things, many different sounds, many different structures. Don't worry about this whole business about getting things right. I mean, I speak languages very well. I make mistakes all the time. It doesn't matter. When I'm corrected on these mistakes, of course, I'll be a little more attentive next time, and it's possible that I will eventually start to get those things right. But the main thing is to communicate. And so we need to fundamentally change. Language learning should not be test-oriented. It should be communication-oriented. It should be fun. It's not something where you're about to get hit over the head if you got something wrong. So if we can do that with kids, and if we can interest them in 2 or 3 languages, not in order to measure their performance, but in order to let them enjoy these languages, then I think we can go a long way towards creating a more multilingual world. So there you have it. Look forward to your comments.